Hey, Pastor Adam here. You know, this last Sunday, one of the things that 1 Samuel chapters 2 and 3 talks about is the corruption that was going on in the tabernacle among the priests and specifically among Eli's two sons. And is there that kind of corruption happening in the church today? Yes. And if you didn't know that, there is. And just so you know, that is happening, and it is now well documented. We, I think, can forgive times in the past when we just weren't aware, but it's incredibly well documented. The same kind of corruption. Think about the corruption that was happening in the tabernacle. What would happen? Well, people would come to the tabernacle and they would bring the offering, and then Hophni and Phinehas would basically take a cut that they weren't supposed to. There was a cut that they were supposed to take as a support for them. It's nothing wrong with pastors and ministers being paid by the church, nothing wrong with that, but they would take a cut that they weren't supposed to. And they were living large and excessively in a way that they weren't supposed to. Then, in addition, they were also basically like, here, do this for me, so I'll give you a position. There was some corruption that way. They were also sleeping around with the women who were supposed to serve at the tabernacle, but they were taking advantage of their position and authority for these sort of illicit affairs that were happening. Whether they were consensual or not, given the power dynamics, I'll leave for you to decide. But this is the kind of thing that was happening then. It's the kind of thing that's happening now. You know, Hillsong, what was happening there has been so well documented. There have been, there was that huge documentary on Hulu. There have been podcasts. There have been blogs, right? That these things were happening where the leading senior ministers in that church were living large, living in excess, exorbitant salaries, exorbitant bonuses. They would get paid a salary, but then there would also be a budget to pay for their wardrobe that was separate from their reported salary. All of these things were happening in a way that was very out there. And then there was now come out that there were multiple affairs, basically like massive immorality happening among the higher echelons of the church. And that was going all through. And then there was also that kind of corruption where if you knew somebody, you were the brother-in-law of somebody else, then you'd get a key position, whether you were qualified for that position or not. And you might say, well, that's just Hillsong. That's like one group. I guarantee it's happening in places that you'd be shocked that it's happening. And what do I mean by that? Have you ever supported a radio ministry? This is a thing. Now, radio is not really a thing anymore. Everything's podcasts and YouTube and all that. But before that, there was radio. And radio is still a big thing for certain churches and older Christians, right? That is still a thing. And so they had these teaching ministries. And what would happen is big church would start a teaching ministry. And they would put the sermons from the pastor on the radio, and you'd have, well-known pastors who would have their radio ministry all over radio stations across the country. And then even like bigger and more ambitious ones would film them, and then they would have television broadcasts of those sermons. You'd find them on like local stations. When I was a kid, it was the local independent stations. They would buy time at like 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning because it was super cheap to buy airtime then. And so there would be, the Hour of Power with Dr. Schuler in the Crystal Cathedral, and there would be David Jeremiah and these different people, Charles Stanley, and these different people would have their sermons. An edited version of their sermon would be broadcast. Maybe there'd be some high quality music or something like that included in, maybe a testimonial or an interview. They would create this television church service, and it would be on every Saturday morning, every Sunday morning, sometimes during the week at like 5 a.m. or something like that. And you would see, there's that guy. He preaches in that big glass building, and he's always there, and he's always very positive and everything. And then, of course, there was like TBN and these other Christian channels that, broadcast Christian stuff on local channels and then on cable 24 hours a day. And so these sort of things would happen, but here's what you didn't necessarily know, is they would spin off these radio ministries and television ministries into separate corporations. And so you would have the church, right? Like there might be, mega church, and they'd be a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And then there would be the radio or television ministry, and that radio or television ministry is a different corporation. And so then what happens is megachurch pastor gets paid by the church, And they would say, oh, well, yes, he has a large salary, but he has so much responsibility and so many people he oversees and so many things he does, and he has to preach 10 times a week. And so, yes, he's paid a large salary, but it's commensurate with his responsibilities as functionally the CEO of our large organization. And then he's paid an equally large salary over here as, the CEO of this radio or television ministry. And so that's why some of these guys that have these massive ministries, they were double dipping. And then what would happen is they would go on the conference circuit. Hillsong actually institutionalized this, where you would get invited to speak at a Hillsong conference, but the expectation is that you would then invite Hillsong preachers back to your church or your conference and pay them an exorbitant fee to come and speak. So you would come and you'd get invited and you'd maybe make like $10,000 speaking at the Hillsong conference, plus all of your travel and everything and incidentals paid for. But then the expectation was that you would invite their guy back to your church in 6 months and he'd get paid $20,000. Do you see where I'm getting at here? And so this sort of back and forth scam would happen between conference speakers. And you go, wait a minute, what? Yeah. So people come, they just come to one conference. They think, oh, cool, this isn't a thing. But they don't realize that there's a whole circuit of conferences, either nationwide or in Hillsong's case, globally. And the conference speakers are going back and forth to all of these different conferences. And in addition to the salary they make from their church and the salary they make from any book sales, because they're selling books at these conferences and they're making money from that too. And then the salary that they're making from any side ministries that they've formed in separate corporations, they would also make money from this conference gig. And then they're making, in some cases, $500,000, $1 million a year as pastors, supposedly. Now, I'm not in on that gig, by the way. Here's what I'm saying is, the same things that we are seeing here, we're seeing all around. I have a friend who went down, took over a large ministry in Southern California. Southern California is like the West Coast Bible Belt, massive megachurches everywhere, like here, megachurch, there, megachurch, everywhere, megachurch. And the pastor of this big megachurch that's super influential down in the LA area died. And everybody was like, oh my goodness, it's so terrible. And this guy I knew, his father-in-law took over. And he said, oh my gosh, it's such a mess. Behind the scenes, all of this stuff was going on. And the guy I knew down there was telling me about it. And he said the great thing was that because it was such a big church and because that guy was so like walled off from everybody, he didn't even live in the same city. He would come in on Sundays to preach, and then he'd come in like once a week to meet with the staff, and then he just basically worked from home for the last 20 years. But he said that basically kept him from like hurting more lives because there was all kinds of corruption and scandal and everything going on. So what do you do? How do you avoid this? How does the church stop this? We can't control what's happening elsewhere. We can't control what they're doing over there. And we're a small church. What are we going to do about it? I would say 3 things. First of all, we can be about relationship. We're part of the Pacific Conference. This next week we have annual conference. And with annual conference, one of the things that we have is relationship. We give money to the conference every month. We support the work that the conference is doing, but we also have relationship with them. We know what's going on. We see what's happening. We have relationship through the conference with the rest of our denomination. We see what's going on. We know what's happening. Relationship builds accountability, transparency, all of that. So the first thing is have relationship. You're never going to have relationship. I had a friend who got a different job, moved to another part of the country, and he was excited because it was where a pastor that he liked his podcast were, so he started going to that church. And 6 months later, he wasn't going there anymore. And I said, why aren't you going there anymore? And he said, because I realized I'm never going to know anybody here. I'm certainly never going to know this pastor. He said, this pastor he came and he told a story one Sunday morning how he had flown across the country and then he'd just flown back in that morning to preach, but he had flown to do the wedding of some friend of his that was some like sea-level golfer that he knew. But he said he never does the wedding of like just a random person in his church. And so it's that kind of connection, that relationship that's lacking, right? So having relationship is key. I think the rejection of celebrity, there should never be celebrity in the church. There should just be coworkers. Nobody should be exalted or anything like that. We're all just coworkers. Nobody's better than anyone else. If we have relationship, if we reject celebrity, and then if we just have some common sense. If you go to something and you go, how much money did this cost? If you have to think that, there's probably something going on that makes you go, I think if we have relationship, if we reject celebrity and we just have a certain amount of common sense, then we will reject 90+% of all the corruption that is going on in the church. That's my take. That's where I'm at. But this is the kind of thing we talk about. This is the kind of thing we discuss in small groups. This is the kind of thing that we dialogue about as a church family. And so whether you're online or in person, we love to connect, talk about these things. And you're like, hey, what's going on with that? I don't know if I agree with you. That's okay. I'm not dictating to you. I'm starting a conversation. We'll see you this Sunday, online or in person. We see you this week in the small groups, whether online or in person. Our online small group is Wednesday nights, and you just have to email smallgroups@faithonhill.com for the link. God bless you. We'll see you this week as we gather together as a church.